The view from the 82nd floor of the Pendelton Global Headquarters was nothing short of spectacular. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled like a glittering carpet of crushed diamonds beneath a velvet sky. Down there, millions of people scrambled, fought, loved, and survived. Up here, in the suffocating silence of the executive boardroom, Arthur Pendelton felt absolutely nothing. Arthur, at 32, was the sole heir to the Pendelton empire. He was a man carved from the finest marble of high society, impeccably tailored in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, wearing a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most people earned in a decade, and possessing a sharp, striking jawline that constantly graced the covers of financial magazines. Yet, as he stared down at the neon veins of the city, a profound, aching emptiness hollowed out his chest. Behind him, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of practiced, artificial laughter echoed from his own engagement party. He was supposed to be celebrating. Instead, he had retreated to the boardroom, nursing a glass of bourbon. His fiancée, a statuesque socialite named Eleanor, had spent the entire evening discussing the strategic tax benefits of their union. When he had tried to ask her where she wanted to go for their honeymoon, she had nonchalantly replied, "Wherever the paparazzi coverage will benefit the company stocks the most, darling." That was the breaking point. It wasn't just Eleanor, it was everyone. His friends were board members in waiting. His romantic interests were corporate acquisitions. He was a walking, breathing bank account, a human ATM, loved by no one and needed by everyone. Is there anyone in this God-forsaken world who would look at me and see a man, instead of a dollar sign? Arthur murmured to the empty room. The glass in his hand felt incredibly heavy. He set the bourbon down on the mahogany table. A reckless, desperate idea had been brewing in his mind for months, a foolish fantasy he had always dismissed as cinematic nonsense. But tonight, the suffocating grip of his gilded cage was too tight. He didn't want to be Arthur Pendelton the billionaire anymore. He wanted to strip it all away. He wanted to know if he, the soul beneath the silk ties and the inherited wealth, was worth anything at all. Arthur moved swiftly. He bypassed the party, slipping into his private office. He took off the Patek Philippe, leaving it on his desk. He emptied his pockets, the black titanium credit cards, the keys to his fleet of sports cars, the state-of-the-art smartphone. He locked them all in his personal safe. From a forgotten gym bag in his closet, he pulled out a pair of faded, oversized sweatpants and a worn, gray hoodie he occasionally used for boxing. He swapped his Italian leather Oxfords for a pair of scuffed, muddy sneakers he kept for hiking. He looked at himself in the mirror. He ruffled his perfectly styled hair until it stood in chaotic, untamed waves. He rubbed a bit of ash from the fireplace onto his jaw and cheeks to darken his complexion and hide his aristocratic pallor. He didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked invisible. Taking the service elevator down to the loading docks, Arthur stepped out into the freezing, unforgiving night. The transition from billionaire to beggar was a brutal, physical shock. Arthur had expected the cold, but he hadn't anticipated the profound psychological violence of becoming a ghost. For the first 2 weeks, the streets chewed him up and spat him out. He slept on rigid park benches with newspapers stuffed under his hoodie for insulation. He learned the harsh geography of alleyways, the terrifying hierarchy of the homeless, and the gnawing, acidic pain of genuine hunger. But the hardest part wasn't the physical suffering, it was the eyes. When he was Arthur Pendelton, people looked at him with deference, fear, or calculated desire. Now, as a nameless vagrant huddled on a street corner, people didn't look at him at all. Their eyes slid right over him, avoiding him as if acknowledging his existence would somehow infect them with his poverty. Women clutched their designer handbags tighter when he walked past. Men in suits just like the ones he owned sneered in disgust or barked at him to get a job. He was entirely alone. The experiment was proving his darkest fears. Without his money, he was garbage. humanity was cold, transactional, and cruel. By the third week, a bitter November rainstorm swept through the city. Soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and entirely out of the $5 he had initially allowed himself, Arthur dragged his freezing body down a quiet, cobblestone street in the older district of the city. The neon lights of the skyscrapers were a blurry, distant memory here. Seeking refuge from the torrential downpour, he huddled under the faded, striped canvas awning of a small corner shop. The sign above read, "The Crust and Crumb Bakery." Through the fogged-up glass of the storefront, a warm, golden light spilled out onto the wet pavement. The smell of cinnamon, melting butter, and rising yeast seeped through the cracks of the door, an aroma so intoxicatingly comforting it made Arthur's empty stomach cramp with sharp agony. He curled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his soaked hoodie, burying his face in his knees to preserve whatever body heat he had left. He just needed to survive the night. Tomorrow, he would go back. He would admit defeat, return to his tower, marry Eleanor, and accept his hollow, miserable destiny. A soft chime rang out as the bakery door opened. Arthur flinched, expecting the familiar shout of a manager telling him he was loitering and threatening to call the police. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the kick or the cruel words. "Hey." The voice was soft, melodic, and laced with a gentle exhaustion. It wasn't an order, it was a greeting. Arthur slowly raised his head, blinking against the rain and the golden light. Standing in the doorway was a young woman. She was petite, wearing a flour-dusted apron over a simple, faded yellow sweater. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, with stray strands sticking to her damp forehead. She had flour on her cheek and dark circles under her eyes, evidence of a grueling, 12-hour shift. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or wearing heavy, perfect makeup like the women in his world. Yet, as Arthur looked up at her, he thought she was the most breathtakingly beautiful creature he had ever seen. She wasn't looking at him with disgust. She was looking at him with deep, unadulterated empathy. "You must be freezing," she said, her voice barely louder than the falling rain. She didn't wait for a reply. She knelt down right there on the filthy, wet concrete, unbothered by the grime staining her jeans. From behind her back, she produced a large, steaming paper bag and a thick cardboard cup. "I baked a little too much today," she lied smoothly, a soft, encouraging smile touching her lips. "If I don't give it away, I have to throw it out. And it's a crime against humanity to throw out a perfectly good cinnamon-braided loaf. Plus, the coffee is fresh. Black, 2 sugars. I hope that's okay." Arthur stared at the outstretched food, his hands trembling not just from the cold, but from the sheer shock of her kindness. He slowly reached out, his soot-stained fingers brushing against her warm skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "Tea, thank you," Arthur rasped. His voice was hoarse from days of silence. "You're welcome," she said brightly, standing back up and wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Clara, by the way. I own this little place. Well, own is a strong word, the bank mostly owns it, but I bake the bread." "Arthur," he whispered, holding the warm cup of coffee like it was the Holy Grail. "It's nice to meet you, Arthur. Try to stay dry tonight, okay? If you're around tomorrow evening, I usually have leftovers around 8 o'clock. She gave him one last, radiant smile before stepping back inside and locking the door, flipping the sign to closed. Arthur sat there in the cold, the rain pouring around him, but he no longer felt the chill. He tore off a piece of the warm bread and took a bite. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He took a sip of the sweet, hot coffee, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in the center of his chest. Clara hadn't just given him food. She had looked him directly in the eyes. She had spoken to him like an equal. She didn't know he was a billionaire. To her, he was the absolute lowest rung of society, a dirty, wet man sleeping on the sidewalk. And yet, she had offered him grace, humor, and warmth. As Arthur watched her through the window, sweeping the floors of her little bakery with a tired but contented look on her face, the hardened, cynical shell around his heart cracked wide open. The billionaire who had everything suddenly realized the only thing he actually wanted was on the other side of that glass. He wasn't going back to the tower tomorrow. The experiment wasn't over. In fact, for Arthur Pendelton, life had just begun. He took another bite of the bread, making a silent vow to himself. He was going to wash his clothes in the shelter tomorrow. He was going to find a day labor job. He was going to earn a few honest dollars, and he was going to buy a coffee from Clara like a real customer. He was a prince who had chosen to become a beggar, but sitting there in the rain, Arthur realized he had just found a queen. The morning after the rainstorm, Arthur Pendleton did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. Interning at his father's lowest-level subsidiaries, he went looking for a job. He didn't return to the 82nd floor of the Pendleton Global Tower. Instead, he walked 3 miles to a gritty, dust-choked construction site on the city's east side. When the gruff foreman took one look at Arthur's soft hands and hesitant posture, he laughed, but a sudden shortage of laborers meant Arthur was handed a hard hat and a sledgehammer anyway. For the next 10 hours, Arthur hauled broken concrete, hauled steel rebar, and inhaled thick, acrid drywall dust. By the end of the day, his back screamed in agony, his palms were a landscape of ruptured, bleeding blisters, and his muscles shook with a profound, terrifying weakness. The foreman handed him 65 crumpled dollars in an envelope. It was less money than Arthur typically spent on a single glass of scotch. Yet, as he held those thin green bills, he felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly knocked him over. He had earned this. Not his name, not his trust fund. He had earned it. That evening, after scrubbing the grime from his skin at a public shelter and buying a cheap, clean flannel shirt from a thrift store, Arthur walked back to the Crust and Crumb Bakery. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully. Clara was behind the counter, wiping down the display case. When she looked up, her tired eyes widened in surprise, taking in his clean face, his new shirt, and the absence of the rain-soaked despair that had clung to him the night before. "Arthur," she breathed, a genuine smile breaking across her face, illuminating the small shop. Arthur stepped up to the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never had during multi-million-dollar board meetings. He carefully slid 3 crumpled single-dollar bills across the glass. "1 large black coffee, please." And he hesitated, glancing at the remaining pastries. "A slice of that lemon pound cake, if you don't mind." Clara looked at the money, then up at his bandaged, blistered hands. Her gaze softened with a profound, quiet understanding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She simply rang up the order, her fingers brushing his as she handed him his change. "Freshly brewed," she said softly. "And I gave you the biggest slice of cake I could find. It's good to see you, Arthur." That $3 transaction marked the beginning of a new life. Over the next 6 months, a rhythm established itself. Arthur worked grueling day labor jobs, roofing, digging trenches, hauling cargo, returning every evening to the bakery. He became a fixture in Clara's life, and she in his. They would sit on the mismatched bar stools by the window as the sun set, talking as she closed up the shop. Arthur learned that Clara was relentlessly hard-working, quick-witted, and fiercely independent, though she carried a strange, heavy exhaustion that seemed too profound for a simple baker. She told him she had moved to the city to escape a complicated past, seeking a quiet, honest life. In return, Arthur, terrified of his own lies, kept his story vague. He told her he was an orphan who had lost his way, trying to rebuild his life from scratch. He lived in constant fear that she would find him lacking. He was just a laborer making minimum wage. But Clara never looked at him with pity or expectation. When she looked at Arthur, She saw a man who worked until his hands bled just to buy a cup of coffee and sit with her. She saw kindness. She saw safety. By the 8th month, Arthur finally gathered the courage to ask her out on a proper date. He had saved $40, a fortune in his current reality. He took her to a free botanical garden on a crisp Sunday afternoon, followed by dinner at a bustling, neon-lit street food vendor. As they sat on a park bench, eating greasy dumplings from paper cartons, Arthur watched the wind catch the loose strands of Clara's dark hair. She was laughing at a terrible joke he had made, her eyes crinkling at the corners. There were no paparazzi hiding in the bushes. There were no board members judging their pedigree. There was just the cool evening air, the taste of cheap food, and the intoxicating sound of her laughter. "I've been to fancy restaurants," Clara said suddenly, looking down at her carton, her smile turning a bit reflective. "In my past. People in suits, tiny portions of food that cost a fortune, everyone pretending to be someone they aren't." She looked up, her gaze locking onto his with a piercing intensity. "I hated it. I hated every second of it. I would choose this bench, and these dumplings, and you, over any of that, Arthur. Any day." Arthur's breath hitched. He felt a sharp, agonizing stab of guilt at the mention of the world he had secretly come from, but it was quickly eclipsed by a tidal wave of love. He reached out, taking her flour-dusted hand in his calloused one. "I don't have much, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't give you luxury." "I don't want luxury," she whispered back, leaning in. "I just want you." When their lips met, Arthur felt the last remnants of the cynical, hollow billionaire shatter into dust. He was entirely, irrevocably hers. Winter arrived with a brutal vengeance, bringing with it the harsh realities of their poverty. Arthur had managed to rent a tiny, decrepit one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the industrial district. The heater barely worked, the plumbing rattled like a dying engine, and there was a persistent water stain on the ceiling that dripped when it snowed. Clara's bakery was struggling, too. The ancient commercial oven kept breaking down, and Arthur spent his weekends covered in grease, using borrowed tools to patch it together because they couldn't afford a repairman. There were nights when Arthur lay awake, listening to Clara's soft breathing beside him in the freezing dark, his mind racing with temptation. He was a billionaire. He could walk to a payphone, make a single call to his wealth manager, and within an hour, they could be sitting in a heated limousine on their way to a penthouse. He could buy her 100 brand new commercial ovens. He could buy her the entire city block. But every time the urge surfaced, terror stopped him. Clara had explicitly told him she despised the world of the wealthy. She loved Arthur the laborer. If he revealed that he was Arthur Pendelton, the very embodiment of the corporate greed she had fled, he was certain she would walk out the door and never look back. The lie had grown too big. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, held hostage by his desperate need to keep her. On their one-year anniversary of the day they met, Arthur decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had saved for 3 months, skipping meals and taking double shifts in the freezing sleet. He walked into a rundown pawn shop and purchased a silver-plated ring with a modest, glittering cubic zirconia stone. It cost him $95. To the old Arthur, it would have been an insult; to the new Arthur, it was a king's ransom. He proposed in their freezing, leaky apartment. He lit a dozen cheap teal-eyed candles, casting a flickering, golden glow over the peeling wallpaper. When Clara walked in, exhausted and smelling of yeast and vanilla, Arthur dropped to one knee. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He opened the small velvet box. "I know this isn't a diamond. I know this apartment is cold, and I know I am just a guy who fixes roofs and hauls dirt. But you are the only warmth I have ever known in this life. You saved me. If you let me, I will spend the rest of my days trying to be a man worthy of your heart. Will you marry me?" Clara dropped her purse. Her hands flew to her mouth, and tears hot, fast, and heavy spilled down her cheeks. She didn't look at the peeling wallpaper. She didn't care that the ring wasn't a diamond. She dropped to her knees right in front of him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Yes, she sobbed, holding onto him as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. Yes, Arthur. It's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen. I love it. I love you. They were married 2 weeks later at the municipal courthouse. There were no floral arrangements, no string quartets, no Eleanor or calculating socialites. Clara wore a simple, second-hand white sundress, and Arthur wore his thrift store button-down. Their witnesses were a board court clerk and a janitor. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Arthur kissed his bride with a passion that rivaled the burning of 1,000 suns. It was the happiest day of his life. But as the honeymoon phase settled into the grueling routine of domestic poverty, the guilt inside Arthur began to fester like an open wound. One night, a severe blizzard hit the city. The radiator in their apartment gave out completely. Arthur lay in bed, wrapped in 3 thin blankets, holding a shivering Clara against his chest to share body heat. She was fast asleep, her face pale in the moonlight leaking through the frosted window. Arthur stared at the water stain on the ceiling, a silent tear escaping his eye and rolling into his hairline. He tightened his arms around his wife. He couldn't let her suffer like this anymore. He couldn't let the woman he worshipped freeze in the dark while billions of dollars sat idle under his name. I just need more time, he thought desperately, kissing the top of her cold head. I need to figure out how to tell her without losing her. In the freezing shadows of their bedroom, Arthur made a silent, unbreakable vow. 1 year. I will give us 1 year of marriage to prove to her that my soul belongs to her, no matter what my bank account says. And on our first wedding anniversary, I will tell her the truth. I will endure her anger, I will beg for her forgiveness, and then I will give her the world. But Arthur didn't know that as he lay there, making grand promises to the dark, the shivering woman in his arms had a secret of her own. And the world he planned to give her was a world she was already desperately running from. Married life in the cramped, water-stained apartment on 4th Street was a masterclass in survival, but for Arthur, it was also paradise. For the first time in his 32 years of existence, he was loved not for the Pendelton name, but for the callus on his hands and the devotion in his eyes. He and Clara built a universe within those 4 peeling walls. They danced to a crackling, thrift store radio in the kitchen, shared bowls of cheap instant ramen by the light of a single bulb, and laughed until their sides ached at the absurdity of their broken radiator. But hiding a billion-dollar upbringing is a heavy burden, and as the months wore on, Arthur found the exhaustion of his lie weighing on him. He had spent his entire life being trained to recognize the finest things the world had to offer: art, textiles, wine, real estate, and corporate strategy. He was a predator raised in the absolute apex of the financial food chain. And it was precisely this ingrained, inescapable training that first made him realize his sweet, struggling baker wife was a walking contradiction. The first crack in the facade appeared in late January, during a particularly brutal cold snap that turned the city streets into a frozen wasteland. Arthur had just returned from a grueling 12-hour shift at a lumber yard. He was covered in sawdust, his muscles screaming in protest. As he walked through the door of their freezing apartment, expecting to see Clara bundled in her usual 3 layers of mismatched, moth-eaten sweaters, he froze. Clara was standing by the tiny stove, stirring a pot of soup. Draped over the back of their singular, wobbly wooden dining chair was a coat. It wasn't just a coat. It was a masterpiece. Arthur slowly took off his boots, his eyes locked onto the garment. Even from 5 feet away, his trained eyes registered the matte, butter-soft texture of the fabric. It was camel hair, but not just any camel hair. It was spun with vicuna, the rarest, most expensive wool in the world, harvested only in the high Andes. He walked closer, his heart beginning to beat a strange, erratic rhythm. He reached out, letting his rough, blistered fingertips brush the lapel. It felt like liquid warmth. The stitching was entirely invisible, done by hand. There were no brand tags, no logos which, in Arthur's world, was the ultimate sign of stealth wealth. A coat like this wasn't bought off a rack, it was commissioned in a private atelier in Milan or Paris. It easily cost $15,000. "Hey, honey," Clara called out cheerfully, turning around with a wooden spoon in her hand. "You're home early. Soup's almost ready." Arthur quickly pulled his hand away from the coat, swallowing hard. He forced a smile, though his mind was racing. "Hey, beautiful. Yeah, the foreman let us go before the snow got too bad." He gestured toward the chair, trying to keep his voice casual, as if he were merely an uneducated laborer admiring a pretty color. "That's quite a coat. Where did you get it?" Clara barely glanced at it, her expression entirely unbothered. She poured 2 bowls of steaming broth. "Oh, that old thing? I got incredibly lucky today. The Salvation Army thrift store 3 blocks down was having a clearance bin sale. $5. Can you believe it? Someone must have died and their kids just threw all their old winter stuff away. It keeps the wind out perfectly." Arthur stared at her. Her lie was flawless. There was no stutter, no avoiding his gaze, no nervous twitch. She handed him a bowl of soup with a bright, innocent smile. "Wow," Arthur managed to say, taking the bowl. $5. That's a steal, Clara." "I know." She laughed, sitting down across from him. "Honestly, rich people throw away the craziest things. Their loss is my gain." Arthur ate his soup in silence, the cheap broth tasting like ash in his mouth. Rich people do not throw away bespoke vicuna, he thought frantically. Even if they did, a thrift store sorter would immediately recognize the weight and texture and put it in a premium case. He watched his wife happily eating her dinner. Who was she? Was she a thief? Was she holding onto stolen goods for a local syndicate? The theories spun wildly in his head, but looking at her sweet, flour-smudged face, he couldn't reconcile the sinister ideas with the woman he loved. He decided to push the incident to the back of his mind. A fluke, he told himself. A bizarre, impossible fluke. But 2 weeks later, the second crack appeared, and it was impossible to ignore. It was a Friday night, marking their 6-month wedding anniversary. To celebrate, Arthur had splurged. He had saved $10 and bought 2 miserable, thin steaks from the discount butcher, searing them on their tiny, smoking pan. He had lit a candle and set their wobbly table as best he could. When Clara arrived home from the bakery, she was glowing. She held her hands behind her back, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "Happy anniversary, my handsome husband," she beamed, producing a dark, dusty glass bottle. "I know we said no gifts, but the bodega on the corner had a mislabeled clearance rack. $2.50 for a bottle of red wine. I thought we could pretend we're fancy tonight." Arthur chuckled, moved by her gesture. "Clara, you didn't have to do that. But thank you. Let me open it." He took the bottle from her hands. The moment the glass touched his skin, his blood ran cold. The label was faded, yellowed with age, and entirely in French. It bore the unmistakable crest of a vineyard Arthur had visited personally with his father a decade ago. It was a 1996 Chateau Margaux Premier Grand Cru class. Arthur's breath hitched. This wasn't just an expensive bottle of wine. This was a legendary vintage. In the high society auctions Arthur used to frequent, a single bottle of this exact vintage commanded upwards of $5,000, and that was if you could find one that had been properly cellared. "I'll get the glasses," Clara chirped, oblivious to the fact that her husband looked as though he had just seen a ghost. She pulled down two cheap, thick glass tumblers. They didn't own wine glasses. Arthur's hands shook as he used a flimsy plastic corkscrew to extract the cork. He had to use every ounce of his willpower not to decant it, not to treat it with the reverence it demanded. As he poured the dark, ruby-red liquid into the cheap tumblers, the incredibly complex aroma of blackcurrant, truffles, and crushed violets immediately filled the small kitchen. It was intoxicating. It was perfect. Clara picked up her tumbler, clinking it against his. To us. To surviving the winter. To us, Arthur echoed faintly. Clara took a large gulp, the way one might drink cheap grape juice. She smacked her lips. It's a bit earthy, isn't it? Kind of tastes like dirt, but in a good way. Definitely worth the $2.50. Arthur slowly brought the glass to his lips and took a sip. The velvet texture, the explosion of perfectly balanced tannins, the lingering finish, it was immaculate. It had been stored in a temperature-controlled cellar for decades. It certainly hadn't been sitting on a bodega rack next to the lottery tickets. Yeah, Arthur croaked, staring at his wife over the rim of his glass. He was a billionaire in disguise, but in that moment, he felt like the one being played. Tastes like dirt. Good find, honey. The mysteries began to compound. The next month, Arthur brought home a battered, completely dead laptop he had found in a dumpster, hoping to scrap it for a few copper wires to sell. He left it on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. When he came out, Clara was sitting at the table, her fingers flying across the keyboard at a blistering speed, lines of complex, encrypted code reflecting in her eyes. The laptop was fully operational. How did you fix that? Arthur asked, stunned. The motherboard was fried. Clara slammed the laptop shut instantly, a rare flash of panic crossing her features before she smoothed it over with a casual shrug. Oh. I just jiggled the battery pack. My brother used to fix radios when we were kids. Guess I picked up a trick or two. Look, it plays solitaire now. Arthur didn't say anything. He just nodded. The baker who couldn't afford a new oven was casually writing kernel-level bypass code in her pajamas. The lie was getting deeper, thicker, and far more dangerous. But before Arthur could confront her, a crisis struck that threatened to destroy the fragile, secretive world they had built. It began with whispers in the neighborhood. Men in sharp, gray suits began pacing the cracked sidewalks of 4th Street, holding clipboards and pointing at the crumbling brick buildings. Then came the letters. Arthur came home one evening to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a piece of heavy, watermarked parchment. She looked paler than usual, her shoulders slumped in defeat. What is it? Arthur asked, dropping his lunchbox and rushing to her side. Clara silently slid the paper toward him. It was a formal notice of eviction. The entire city block, including their apartment building and the street where Clara's bakery stood, had been targeted for a hostile acquisition by Apex Holdings, a ruthless real estate conglomerate known for bulldozing low-income neighborhoods to build luxury condominiums. They had 30 days to vacate. Arthur felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He knew Apex Holdings. He knew their CEO, a sleazy, aggressive man named Richard Sterling, who had been a minor rival of Pendelton Global for years. Sterling was a bottom feeder, a man Arthur had once publicly humiliated at a charity gala for his unethical business practices. The landlord sold the building, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't even tell us. They're tearing it all down, Arthur. The apartment, the bakery. Everything. We have nowhere to go. We have nothing. Seeing the despair in his wife's eyes snapped something deep inside Arthur. The billionaire he had buried alive violently clawed his way back to the surface. He could play the poor, humble laborer and ignore the vicuna coats and the $5,000 wine, but he would absolutely not allow Richard Sterling to make his wife cry. He pulled Clara into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice carrying a steely, dangerous undertone that he usually reserved for hostile boardroom takeovers. "I promise you, Clara. We aren't going anywhere. I'll take care of it." Clara looked up at him, a tear slipping down her cheek. "How, Arthur? We have $80 in our savings jar. We can't fight a corporation." "Just trust me," he murmured. That night, long after Clara had cried herself to sleep, Arthur slipped out of bed. He pulled on his boots and a heavy jacket, leaving the apartment and walking 5 blocks in the freezing wind until he found a grimy, graffiti-covered payphone outside a closed laundromat. He dug a quarter out of his pocket, a quarter he had found on the street that morning, and dropped it into the slot. He dialed a private, unlisted number he hadn't called in 14 months. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Pendelton Global, Executive Legal. Harrison speaking." "Thomas," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly back into the commanding cadence of the CEO he truly was. "It's Arthur." There was a deafening silence on the other end of the line. A sharp intake of breath. "Mr. Pendelton?" "Sir." "My God, we thought you were dead." "The police, the private investigators. Cancel them all, Thomas." "I'm alive, I'm well, and I don't have time to explain," Arthur interrupted sharply. "I need you to execute a maneuver immediately. Apex Holdings is attempting a hostile buyout of the residential block on East 4th and Mercer. I want you to block it. Set up a blind shell company, authorize a counter-offer, and bury Richard Sterling in so much legal red tape he chokes on it. Buy the block out from under him. Use my personal discretionary fund." There was the sound of furious typing on the other end. "East 4th and Mercer? Sir, that's a slum. Why would Pendelton Global?" "Just do it, Thomas." Arthur barked, the ice in his voice freezing the lawyer into silence. "I want that block secured by morning." There was a pause. More typing. Then, Thomas cleared his throat, his voice laced with intense confusion. "Sir. I'm looking at the county registry right now. I can't initiate a buyout." "Why the hell not?" Arthur demanded, his grip tightening on the plastic phone receiver. "Is Sterling's contract already airtight?" "No, sir. Sterling's acquisition was blocked 3 hours ago." Arthur frowned, the freezing wind whipping his hair into his eyes. "Blocked? By whom? Who else would care about a decaying block in the East End?" "That's the strange part, Mr. Pendelton," Thomas said slowly. "It wasn't blocked with legal tape. It was blocked with a sledgehammer. An anonymous, private offshore entity just bought the entire deed to the 4th Street block in cash. They paid double the asking price. $10 million, wired in full, 0 contingencies. The landlord already signed it over. Richard Sterling has been entirely shut out. Whoever bought this block has incredibly deep pockets and moved with terrifying speed." Arthur stood frozen in the phone booth. The neon light of the laundromat buzzed loudly in the silence. $10 million. In cash. An anonymous buyer who moved with lethal corporate precision to protect the exact building where Arthur and Clara lived, on the exact day the eviction notice arrived. Arthur hung up the phone without another word. The quarter clattered into the coin return slot. He walked slowly back to the apartment, the biting cold doing nothing to cool the raging storm in his mind. He climbed the creaky stairs, unlocked the thin wooden door, and stepped into the cramped bedroom. The moonlight illuminated Clara. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even, huddled under the thin blankets. Her face was angelic, innocent, and peaceful. Arthur stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the woman he had married. He thought about the $15,000 vicuna coat. He thought about the 1996 Chateau Margaux. He thought about the encrypted kernel code she had typed with the speed of a seasoned hacker. And now, a $10 million anonymous cash drop to save their home. Arthur took a deep breath, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face in the dark. "Who the hell are you, Clara?" he whispered to the shadows. He had spent the last year pretending to be a beggar to see if she would love him. He was finally realizing that the woman who had happily married a pauper might just be the most powerful person he had ever met. The rules of the game had just changed entirely, and Arthur, the corporate apex predator, was suddenly very, very eager to see his wife's hand. The morning after the cryptic phone call in the freezing wind, the cramped apartment on 4th Street felt smaller than ever. The leaky faucet dripped a relentless rhythm into the rusted sink. The single-pane window rattled against the winter gale. And Arthur Pendleton, sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, felt an electrical current of anticipation humming beneath his skin. Clara was already gone, having slipped out at dawn for her shift at the bakery. Before leaving, she had kissed his cheek and whispered, "Don't worry about the eviction, Arthur. I have a feeling everything is going to be okay." Arthur had simply smiled, a tight, knowing expression, and kissed her back. "You have no idea, my love," he had thought. Now, alone in the quiet apartment, Arthur knew the time for games had passed. The one-year anniversary of their meeting was only days away, but the timeline had been violently accelerated. The $10 million anonymous buyout of their city block had set a timer on their fragile, secretive life. Arthur had spent the entire night analyzing the situation with the ruthless, calculating precision that had made him the most feared CEO in the city. There was only one logical explanation for the anonymous cash drop: Clara. The Vicuna code. The 1996 Chateau Margaux. The kernel-level coding. And now, a $10 million financial execution. His sweet, struggling wife, who cried over a $95 cubic zirconia ring, was holding a royal flush. Arthur didn't know who she really was, or why she was hiding in a decrepit bakery in the slums, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was not going to let her fight Richard Sterling and Apex Holdings alone. He was going to end this. Today. Arthur stood up, leaving the thin, scratchy blankets behind. He walked to the small, battered closet and bypassed his faded flannels and dusty work boots. Instead, he reached up to the highest shelf, pulling down a dusty, nondescript duffel bag he hadn't touched in over a year. He unzipped it, revealing the life he had buried. Inside lay the armor of Arthur Pendleton. He pulled out a charcoal gray, bespoke Tom Ford three-piece suit, wrapped in a protective garment bag. The wool-silk blend was so fine it felt like water slipping through his calloused, blistered fingers. Next came a crisp, blindingly white Egyptian cotton shirt with French cuffs, a pair of platinum cufflinks forged in the shape of the Pendleton family crest, and finally, a sleek, black velvet box. He snapped the box open. Resting on the satin cushion was his Patek Philippe Grand Complications watch, a masterpiece of horology worth a staggering sum. He strapped it onto his wrist. The heavy, familiar weight of the platinum against his skin sent a visceral shiver down his spine. The laborer was dead. The apex predator had returned. Arthur walked into the tiny, cracked bathroom. He took a long, scalding shower, washing away the drywall dust, the engine grease, and the scent of cheap bar soap. He shaved his scruff with meticulous care, revealing the sharp, aristocratic jawline that had been hidden beneath the grime of the streets. He combed his hair back with a precision that bordered on lethal. When he stepped out of the bathroom and donned the suit, the transformation was absolute, and it was terrifying. He looked into the cracked, fogged mirror. Staring back at him was not the man who hauled concrete for $65 a day. Staring back was a billionaire who controlled global markets, a man who could bankrupt a country with a single signature. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes cold and focused. He was going to walk into Apex Holdings, he was going to publicly eviscerate Richard Sterling, he was going to secure the 4th Street deed under Pendelton Global, and then he was going to come home, lay the deed on this wobbly kitchen table, and finally introduce his wife to her husband. Arthur picked up a burner phone he had bought that morning and dialed Thomas, his head of executive legal. "Bring the car to the corner of 5th and Mercer," Arthur commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "And Thomas? Bring the acquisition papers for Apex Holdings. Not just the residential block. I want to buy Sterling's entire company. Hostile takeover. If he wants to play in my city, I'm taking his board. Right away, Mr. Pendelton. It is profoundly good to have you back, sir." 10 minutes later, Arthur stepped out of the crumbling apartment building. The neighborhood was quiet, the freezing air biting at his face, but the Tom Ford wool kept him perfectly insulated. A sleek, midnight black Maybach S-Class glided silently up to the curb, its tinted windows gleaming like obsidian. The chauffeur, an older man named Higgins who had driven Arthur's father, leapt out of the driver's seat. Higgins looked at Arthur, his eyes widening in shock and relief, tears instantly springing to his eyes. "Mr. Pendelton, sir. We thought." "I know, Higgins," Arthur said smoothly, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder. "I took an extended sabbatical. It's good to see you. Take me to Apex Holdings. And step on it?" "With pleasure, sir." The Maybach tore through the city streets, a dark shark navigating a sea of lesser fish. As they approached the towering, glass and steel monolith of the Apex Holdings headquarters in the financial district, Arthur felt his blood run cold with pure adrenaline. He hadn't felt this alive in a year. He wasn't just defending a real estate asset, he was defending his wife, his home, and the woman he loved more than life itself. The car pulled up to the grand entrance. Arthur stepped out, buttoning his suit jacket. 2 massive security guards moved to intercept him, but as Arthur's icy, unyielding gaze locked onto them, they froze. There was a dark, dangerous aura radiating from him that demanded absolute submission. They stepped aside without a word. Arthur strode into the cavernous, marble-floored lobby. The heels of his custom Italian Oxfords clicked against the stone like gunshots. Receptionists dropped their pens. Executives walking through the atrium stopped dead in their tracks, the color draining from their faces. The ghost of the financial district had returned from the dead, and he looked furious. "Arthur Pendelton." Someone whispered in disbelief. Arthur ignored them all. He bypassed the reception desk entirely, walking straight to the private executive elevator. He swiped a master access card Thomas had provided, and the doors slid shut, rocketing him up to the 70th floor. When the elevator chimed, Arthur stepped out into the lavish, mahogany-paneled executive suite of Apex Holdings. A panicked executive assistant jumped up from her desk. "Sir. You can't be up here. Mr. Sterling is in a closed-door board meeting." "I know," Arthur said softly, never breaking his stride. "I'm the agenda." He reached the towering, double oak doors of the main boardroom. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He placed both hands on the brass handles and shoved the doors open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack, the sound echoing like thunder. "Sterling!" Arthur barked, his voice echoing through the massive room, dripping with venom. "Your hostile takeover ends right now. You are going to sign over the 4th Street deed to Pendelton Global, or I swear to God I will dismantle this pathetic company piece by piece and sell it for scrap." Arthur stepped into the room, ready to unleash a barrage of legal threats that would leave the rival CEO weeping. But the words died in his throat. The boardroom was entirely silent. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the scent of high-stakes fear. Richard Sterling, the usually arrogant, blustering CEO of Apex Holdings, was not sitting at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. He was standing near the window, sweating profusely, his face pale and sickly. He looked terrified, clutching a handkerchief and dabbing nervously at his forehead. The other board members were completely silent, staring down at their legal pads like frightened school children. Arthur stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. If Sterling wasn't running the meeting, who was? Slowly, Arthur's gaze traveled down the length of the massive table. Sitting in the high-backed leather chair at the absolute head of the table, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, was a woman. She was not wearing a flour-dusted apron. She was not wearing a moth-eaten yellow sweater. She was wearing a breathtaking, razor-sharp, custom-tailored white Alexander McQueen pantsuit that screamed lethal authority. A massive, flawless diamond tennis necklace glittered at her throat. Her dark hair, usually tied up in a messy bun, was blown out in a sleek, immaculate cascade over her shoulders. A pair of heavy, black-rimmed designer reading glasses rested on her nose. Her posture was flawless, projecting a terrifying, cold dominance that made Arthur's own boardroom presence pale in comparison. In her perfectly manicured hands, adorned with a Patek Philippe watch identical to Arthur's, she held a thick stack of corporate acquisition papers. She was in the middle of speaking. "And if you do not agree to the liquidation terms by noon, Richard, I will personally ensure the SEC audits every offshore account you possess. Do we have an understand?" The massive doors slamming open had cut her off. Annoyed by the interruption, the woman slowly raised her head, her dark eyes flashing with lethal irritation as she looked down the length of the table toward the intruder. "Who the hell dares to interrupt my—" Her voice stopped. The lethal glare vanished, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. The heavy acquisition papers slipped from her manicured fingers, scattering across the polished mahogany surface. She slowly stood up, her knees trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Arthur felt the floor drop out from underneath him. All the oxygen in the room was instantly sucked into a vacuum. The roaring in his ears drowned out the city traffic outside. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He felt like he had been struck by lightning. The billionaire apex predator staring from the doorway, dressed in a $10,000 Tom Ford suit. The ruthless, terrifying corporate titan standing at the head of the table, dressed in $50,000 of Alexander McQueen couture. Husband and wife. "Clara," Arthur whispered. The word sounded absurd, tiny, and fragile in the cavernous room. Clara pushed her designer glasses down her nose, her mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief as she stared at the flawlessly groomed, terrifyingly powerful billionaire standing in the doorway. She looked at his platinum cufflinks. She looked at his Rolex. She looked at the lethal, cold authority radiating from him, authority that didn't belong to a day laborer making $65 a day. "Arthur." She breathed back, her voice shaking, completely abandoning her commanding corporate tone. What are you wearing? You're supposed to be hauling concrete on 6th Avenue. You're supposed to be baking sourdough. Arthur yelled back, his composure completely shattering as the sheer absurdity of the situation crashed down on him. He pointed a trembling finger at the rival CEO, who was looking back and forth between them in total bewilderment. Are you the anonymous buyer? Did you drop $10 million in cash on 4th Street? Clara's face flushed a deep crimson. She swallowed hard, her intimidating persona dissolving as she desperately tried to explain. "Arthur, I can explain. The oven, the landlord, he was going to evict us. I couldn't let him take our home. With $10 million. Arthur shouted, his voice cracking. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it entirely. "Clara, I bought a cubic zirconia ring. You cried. You told me it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. It is." Clara shouted back, tears of panic welling in her eyes. "It's my favorite ring." "But Arthur, you told me you were an orphan. You told me you couldn't afford to fix the radiator. I couldn't. I mean, I could, but I was pretending. Arthur yelled, stepping further into the room, entirely ignoring the baffled board of directors who were watching the most bizarre domestic dispute in corporate history. I'm Arthur Pendelton. I own Pendelton Global. I own this goddamn building. The boardroom erupted into frantic gasps. Richard Sterling looked as if he was going to faint, clutching his chest. He was currently caught in a hostile crossfire between the missing heir of Pendelton Global and the ruthless woman currently dismantling his company. Clara slumped back into her leather chair, burying her face in her hands. A hysterical, manic giggle bubbled up from her throat. She dragged her hands down her face, looking up at the ceiling as if begging the universe for mercy. Arthur Pendelton, she whispered to the ceiling. I married Arthur Pendelton. The man I've been aggressively shorting in the stock market for the last 2 years. Arthur stopped dead. His jaw dropped. Wait. You're the shadow firm? You're Vanguard Cybernetics? You've been shorting my tech division. Clara looked at him, an apologetic, completely defeated smile spreading across her face. I'm Clara Vance, founder and CEO. I'm so sorry, honey. Your cybersecurity infrastructure was just really outdated. It was easy money. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The two most powerful, wealthy, and ruthless corporate minds in the city stood perfectly still, staring at each other across 40 feet of polished mahogany. They had both abandoned their empires. They had both worn rags, shivered in the cold, and eaten instant ramen in the dark. They had both lied through their teeth to find someone who wouldn't want them for their money. And they had accidentally married each other. Arthur stared at his wife, taking in the sharp suit, the diamonds, and the brilliant, terrifying intellect he had only caught glimpses of before. The shock slowly began to recede, replaced by a massive, overwhelming tidal wave of relief, followed closely by pure, unadulterated amusement. The corners of Arthur's mouth twitched. He let out a low, breathy chuckle. The chuckle turned into a laugh, and suddenly, the fearsome billionaire threw his head back and roared with booming, uncontrollable laughter that shook the boardroom windows. Clara watched him for a second before a huge, genuine smile broke across her face. She started laughing too, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, tears of sheer relief streaming down her cheeks. I bought you a $5 coat. Arthur wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. It was vicuna, Clara. Vicuna. The Salvation Army doesn't sell vicuna. I panicked. Clara cried out, laughing so hard she had to hold her stomach. I didn't know what else to say. And you? The $95 ring. I had to take off a Cartier bracelet every time I walked into the apartment just so I wouldn't look suspicious. Mr. Pendelton. Ms. Vance. Richard Sterling stammered weakly, raising a trembling hand. I don't understand. Are we finalizing the acquisition, or? Arthur and Clara stopped laughing. They both turned to look at the terrified CEO simultaneously. The warmth in their eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a synchronized, lethal corporate glare that made Sterling physically recoil. Arthur walked slowly down the length of the table until he was standing right beside Clara's chair. He reached down, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were soft now, the flour washed away, but they fit perfectly within his. He looked down at her, his heart swelling with an entirely new kind of love, a love for the brilliant, terrifying queen she truly was. Clara, my darling, Arthur said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Sterling. Since you've already started the paperwork, would you like to finish dismantling this man's career, or shall I? Clara smiled up at her husband, a wicked, beautiful gleam in her eye. She squeezed his hand. Let's do it together, honey. And then, I think it's time we finally go shopping for a new radiator. The dismantling of Apex Holdings took exactly 42 minutes. To the terrified board of directors, It felt like 42 years. They sat in paralyzed silence, watching an unprecedented spectacle, the two most brilliant, ruthless corporate predators in the city who also happened to be married to each other flawlessly tag-teaming the destruction of Richard Sterling's career. Arthur handled the real estate leverage, flawlessly citing zoning laws, shell company regulations, and hostile acquisition loopholes with a voice like cracking ice. Clara handled the financial execution, calmly sliding documents across the table that detailed how Vanguard Cybernetics had systematically acquired a controlling interest in Apex's offshore debt over the last 48 hours. They didn't even need to look at each other to coordinate their attack. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of two wolves tearing apart a highly outmatched prey. By the time the clock struck noon, Richard Sterling was weeping into his handkerchief, his trembling hand signing over the deed to the 4th Street block and the entirety of Apex Holdings directly to Pendelton Vance Enterprises, a parent company Arthur and Clara invented on the spot. When the final signature was inked, Arthur calmly picked up the deed to their neighborhood. He folded it neatly, slid it into the inner pocket of his Tom Ford suit, and turned to his wife. "Shall we, Mrs. Pendelton?" he asked, extending his arm with a charming, aristocratic bow that completely contrasted the massacre they had just committed. Clara stood up, adjusting the cuffs of her Alexander McQueen blazer. The diamonds at her throat caught the midday sun. "We shall, Mr. Pendelton. I suddenly have a craving for incredibly cheap instant ramen." They walked out of the boardroom arm in arm, leaving a room full of hyperventilating executives in their wake. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind them, the icy, terrifying corporate facades melted away. They hurried into the private elevator, and as the doors slid shut, sealing them off from the world, the silence stretched for exactly 2 seconds before they both absolutely lost their minds. Clara slumped against the mirrored wall of the elevator, bursting into a fit of breathless, hysterical laughter. She kicked off one of her staggeringly high Christian Louboutin heels, letting it clatter against the floor. "Arthur!" she gasped, clutching her stomach. "Arthur, you ruthless, magnificent bastard. The way you threatened to liquidate his pension. I've never been more turned on in my entire life." Arthur threw his head back, his booming laughter echoing in the small space. He loosened his silk tie, the illusion of the polished billionaire shattering completely as the laborer she loved shone through. "Clara, you hacked his offshore accounts. You casually dropped a $10 million cash block on a slum. Who are you?" The elevator chimed, depositing them into the private underground parking garage. The midnight black Maybach was waiting, with Higgins standing at attention by the rear door. If the old chauffeur was surprised to see the missing heir of Pendelton Global walking arm in arm with a woman dripping in $50,000 of haute couture, he didn't show it. "Back to the office, sir?" Higgins asked smoothly. Arthur looked down at Clara. She looked up at him, a mischievous sparkle in her dark eyes. "No, Higgins," Arthur smiled. "Take us home. 4th Street. And put the privacy partition up, please." As the Maybach glided out into the freezing city streets, Arthur and Clara collapsed against the buttery soft white leather seats. The tinted glass shielded them from the outside world, and the soundproof partition gave them absolute privacy. For a long moment, they just stared at each other in the dim, luxurious cabin, letting the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of their lives wash over them. "All right," Arthur breathed, turning to fully face her. "Talk. Right now. From the beginning. I thought I married a sweet, innocent baker who couldn't afford to fix a commercial oven." Clara groaned, burying her face in her hands. "Oh, God, the oven. Arthur, I paid a mechanic $2,000 to actively sabotage that oven every 3 weeks so you wouldn't get suspicious of how much money the bakery was making." Arthur's jaw dropped. "You sabotaged the oven." "I spent 6 weekends covered in grease fixing that thing." "I know." Clara cried, peeking through her fingers with a highly apologetic cringe. But you looked so proud of yourself every time you fixed it. And your arms looked incredible when you were lifting the heavy metal grates. I couldn't bring myself to stop it. Arthur scrubbed a hand over his face, laughing in disbelief. Okay, okay. Vanguard Cybernetics. I know the firm. It's a phantom company. No one knows who the CEO is. Rumor on Wall Street is that it's worth $50 million. Clara dropped her hands, her expression softening into something vulnerable and sincere. It is, she said quietly. I built it from scratch in my dorm room. By the time I was 26, I had a $50 million net worth. And Arthur, it ruined my life. Arthur's smile faded, his eyes locking onto hers with deep understanding. Every man I dated, Clara continued, her voice barely a whisper, every friend I made, they all changed the moment they saw the bank accounts. I was engaged once, 3 years ago. I found out he had taken out a massive line of credit against my company to fund his own lavish lifestyle before we were even married. He didn't love me. He loved Vanguard. She reached out, gently tracing the line of Arthur's sharp jaw. I faked a breakdown. I stepped down from public view, hired a proxy board to run the day-to-day operations, and I ran. I bought that struggling bakery in the slums because it was the only place in the city where no one wore a suit. I just wanted to be Clara. I wanted to see if anyone could love me when I had flour in my hair and nothing in my pockets. Arthur felt a physical ache in his chest. He reached up, covering her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. You were looking for the exact same thing I was, he murmured. I was, Clara smiled, tears shining in her eyes. And then, one rainy night, this incredibly handsome, freezing homeless man collapsed outside my window. When I gave you that coffee, Arthur, you looked at me like I was an angel. You didn't know about Vanguard. You didn't care. You just saw me. I did, Arthur whispered fiercely, pulling her across the plush leather seats and into his lap. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, burying his face in her sweet-smelling hair. I hated my life, Clara. Pendelton Global was a cage. I was surrounded by vultures. Walking out of that skyscraper and putting on those rags was the best decision I ever made, because it led me straight to you. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady heartbeat beneath the expensive wool of his suit. So, we both went to the most insane, absurd, theatrical lengths possible to find true love, only to accidentally marry another secret millionaire. Basically, yes, Arthur chuckled, the vibration rumbling against her cheek. Clara tilted her head up, a slow, wicked grin spreading across her lips. Does this mean the confessions are open? Because Arthur, I have been holding on to some heavy secrets for a year. Oh, absolutely, Arthur laughed, leaning back. Hit me. Let's clear the air. The 1996 Chateau Margaux you found at the bodega. Shipped directly from my private temperature-controlled cellar in Geneva, Clara admitted without hesitation. I paid a courier $500 to put a fake discount sticker on it and leave it on the bodega counter for exactly 3 minutes so I could discover it. Jesus, Arthur wheezed. Okay. The $15,000 vicuna coat. My tailor in Milan owed me a favor, Clara shrugged. I made him sew a fake Salvation Army tag onto the collar. What about you, Mr. Laborer? How did a guy hauling dirt for minimum wage afford to take me to the botanical gardens and buy me premium street food on our first date? Arthur winced playfully. Well. I own the botanical gardens. I donated the land to the city 5 years ago. And the street food vendor? I gave him a crisp $100 bill before you arrived to make sure you got the absolute best dumplings he had. Clara gasped, smacking his chest. You absolute fraud. What about the dead laptop you found in the dumpster? The one I fixed. Planted, Arthur smirked. I bought it from a scrapyard, specifically picked one with a fried motherboard, and left it out to see if you actually knew how to code, because I caught you reading a cybersecurity manifesto in bed when you thought I was asleep. I hacked the municipal grid. Clara countered loudly, throwing her hands in the air. When we couldn't pay the electricity bill in November and the lights went out, I bypassed the city's mainframe on my phone in the bathroom and routed free power to our apartment for 3 months. I knew it. Arthur roared, throwing his head back in delight. I knew the city wouldn't just forget about us. They laughed until their ribs ached, the Maybach filling with the joyous, unburdened sound of two people who were finally, completely, and unapologetically free. They had both played a dangerous game of deception, but the prize they had won was entirely real. The car slowed, pulling up to the familiar, cracked curb of 4th Street. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had that morning, gray, freezing, and run down. But as Arthur and Clara stepped out of the Maybach, their designer clothes starkly contrasting the crumbling brick around them, they didn't see a slum. They saw the crucible where their love had been forged. They walked hand in hand up the creaky, groaning stairs of their apartment building. Arthur used his cheap brass key to unlock the flimsy door. They stepped inside. The leaky faucet was still dripping. The radiator was still dead. The peeling wallpaper hung in sad, yellowed strips. But as they stood in the center of the tiny, freezing room, a profound sense of peace settled over them both. Arthur turned to Clara, taking both of her hands in his. He looked down at her left hand. Resting on her ring finger, dwarfed by the massive, flawless diamonds of her tennis necklace, was the $95 cubic zirconia ring he had given her. Arthur's thumb gently brushed over the cheap silver band. "Clara," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry I lied to you about this. You deserve flawless diamonds. You deserve the stars ripped from the sky. I'll replace it tomorrow. We'll go to Cartier, Harry Winston, wherever you want." "Stop," Clara interrupted fiercely, pulling her hand away and covering the ring protectively with her other hand. She looked up at him, her dark eyes blazing with absolute certainty. "Don't you dare, Arthur Pendelton. Don't you dare try to replace this." Arthur blinked, surprised by her intensity. "Clara, it's fake glass. I don't care if it's made of plastic." She stepped closer, pressing her palm against his chest. "This ring wasn't bought by a billionaire. It was bought by a man who hauled concrete until his hands bled, who starved himself for 3 months, just to give me something beautiful. This ring represents the purest, most selfless love I have ever known. I will wear the diamonds you buy me, Arthur. I'll wear them to the galas and the board meetings. But this." She kissed the cubic zirconia stone gently. "This stays on my finger until the day I die." Arthur felt a tear slip down his cheek. He looked down at his own hand, where a matching, cheap silver band rested. He had been so afraid of losing her, he hadn't realized that the foundation they had built in the dirt was stronger than anything money could buy. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, deeply passionate kiss that held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. The billionaire and the heiress, standing in the ruins of their magnificent lie, entirely consumed by the truth of their love. "Come on," Arthur whispered against her lips, picking up the dusty duffel bag he had used to hide his suits. "Let's pack our things. Higgins is waiting to take us to the penthouse. We have a corporate empire to merge." Clara smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Just one condition, Mr. Pendelton." "Name it, Mrs. Pendelton. I own the city now, I can give you anything." "I'm keeping the bakery," Clara declared stubbornly. "I genuinely like baking bread. But you are buying me a brand new, state-of-the-art commercial oven. And if it breaks, you're paying a professional to fix it." Arthur laughed, a bright, ringing sound that echoed through the empty apartment one last time. "Deal. But I still expect a free coffee every evening. Only if you pay me $3 crumpled for it," she winked. Together, they walked out of the tiny apartment, locking the door behind them and leaving the shadows of their past behind. They descended the stairs, stepped into the waiting Maybach, and drove off into the glittering, diamond-strewn skyline of the city, no longer a prince in rags or an heiress in hiding, but a king and queen, ready to conquer the world, hand in hand.